Billionaire's wife catches him cheating. Her revenge will shock you. At 6 a.m., FBI agents burst through the glass doors of Harrison Technologies' Manhattan headquarters. Celeste Thompson stood across the street, her caramel skin glowing in the morning light, hazel eyes fixed on the scene unfolding before her. She wore a tailored charcoal coat, and in her perfectly manicured hands was a manila envelope, the evidence that had toppled a billion-dollar empire. Her husband, David Harrison, emerged in handcuffs, flanked by federal agents, his expression a mix of disbelief and defeat. Investors and employees clustered behind barricades, their phones raised, capturing every moment. Celeste remained calm, every detail sharp in her mind, from the marble floors of the lobby to the stunned faces in the crowd. What you're witnessing isn't just the arrest of one of America's most powerful tech billionaires. It's the culmination of a calculated plan executed by the wife everyone thought was only a glamorous accessory. How did a woman who appeared to have everything become the force behind her husband's downfall? The story of betrayal, hidden crimes, and a pursuit of justice begins here. Subscribe and comment where you're watching from. Tomorrow, we reveal the next story that proves courage and strategy can change everything. Let's begin. Celeste Thompson's story didn't begin with wealth or influence. Born to a Puerto Rican mother and an African-American father, she grew up in a middle-class neighborhood in Queens. Her parents valued education above everything, and Celeste carried that ambition into Columbia University, where she completed both her undergraduate degree and law school. By her early 30s, she was already a respected associate at one of Manhattan's most competitive corporate law firms. Her life was busy, driven by case files, late-night strategy sessions, and the thrill of shaping contracts that moved millions of dollars across industries. But everything changed the night she met David Harrison at a Metropolitan Museum of Art charity gala. He was the rising star of the tech world, a charismatic entrepreneur whose company, Harrison Technologies, was being whispered about in Silicon Valley as the next trillion-dollar giant. Their connection was immediate, a whirlwind courtship that ended in a dazzling wedding at the Plaza Hotel. For many, it seemed like a modern fairy tale, the brilliant lawyer and the tech mogul joining forces. Celeste left her law career soon after, not because she lacked ambition, but because David's world demanded it. He needed a partner who could move with ease between investor dinners, technology conferences, and society fundraisers. Celeste, polished and articulate, became the face by his side. She hosted gatherings in their $50 million Fifth Avenue penthouse, where floor-to-ceiling windows framed Central Park like a living mural. From their balcony, she could see the Bethesda Fountain, the very place where David had proposed on a snowy December evening. Their Manhattan home was only the beginning. Summers were spent at their East Hampton estate near Georgica Pond, and winter holidays often took them to their modern glass residence in Palo Alto. Every detail of their life projected success. Dinners at 11 Madison Park, charity galas at the Waldorf Astoria, and private jets whisking them between coasts. Celeste's friends often told her she was living the dream, but she sometimes wondered if it was hers or David's. Still, she believed in their partnership. He often told her that Harrison Technologies was their shared legacy, that her sacrifice allowed him to push boundaries in the tech industry. She trusted that promise. The first fracture appeared during what should have been one of their most intimate traditions, their Memorial Day weekend in East Hampton. The sprawling estate, with its sweeping oceanfront view, had always been their retreat from the chaos of Manhattan. That year, though, David seemed distracted. He was constantly glued to his phone, excusing himself for calls he claimed were with his CFO about the company's IPO plans. Celeste tried to brush it off as the stress of managing a billion-dollar empire, but the change in his behavior was hard to ignore. Small details unsettled her. The way he silenced his phone whenever she entered the room, the late-night text notifications that made him slip into another room, the sudden urgency in his travel schedule. At first, she convinced herself it was temporary, the natural strain of preparing a company for the public market. But doubt has a way of growing in silence. The turning point came one morning after their run along the beach. The house smelled faintly of salt and coffee, and David stepped into the marble-tiled shower, leaving his phone unattended on the bathroom counter. Celeste hadn't planned to look. She walked past it more than once, trying to resist, but the vibration of an incoming message drew her attention. The preview flashed a name she didn't recognize. V. The words chilled her. Can't wait for tonight. Same suite at the St. Regis. Her breath caught as she unlocked the phone, her hands trembling. The thread of messages revealed far more than a casual affair. There were dozens of exchanges stretching back months. Hotel bookings, dinner reservations, whispered endearments, and coded reassurances. It wasn't a fling. It was a second life. The name became clear. Victoria Chun, a 26-year-old venture capitalist David, had met at a San Francisco tech conference. Their exchanges detailed trips across cities, Boston, Chicago, San Francisco, each carefully hidden beneath the cover of business travel. Celeste's heart raced, but it wasn't only the betrayal of intimacy that struck her. The precision, the calculation, the way he maintained one face for her while building another life with someone else. It all felt like a betrayal of the very foundation of their marriage. She closed the phone quietly before David stepped out of the shower, his voice casual, as though nothing had changed. But in that moment, for Celeste, everything had. Celeste stood frozen in the marble bathroom, her reflection staring back at her in the mirror. In her hand, David's phone glowed with the thread of messages she could no longer pretend didn't exist. What began as a single shocking text from V opened into months of conversations, hundreds of them, detailing a life she had never known her husband was living. Each scroll revealed more. Luxury hotel check-ins, private dinners, and flights arranged under the pretense of business trips. There were affectionate notes about missed calls, playful banter about stolen weekends, and in between, plans that carried the unmistakable weight of permanence. David wasn't just having an affair. He was constructing a future with someone else. The name became unmistakable: Victoria Chun. At just 26, she was already a rising venture capitalist with a reputation for spotting bold startups on the West Coast. The messages detailed how they had first met at a technology conference in San Francisco. What began as flirtation quickly evolved into clandestine weekends at the Ritz-Carlton in Boston, the Four Seasons in Chicago, and most recently, the St. Regis in New York. Celeste's breath caught as she reached a message that turned her blood cold. Victoria had written, "I'll tell him next week. We need to plan for the baby." The words hung on the screen like a verdict. Pregnant, David hadn't just betrayed her body and trust. He had crossed into a future that excluded her entirely. A string of replies from him followed, full of promises. "Once the IPO is finalized, I'll make everything official. You and I are the future." The walls of the bathroom seemed to close in as Celeste kept scrolling. Her chest tightened when she came across messages where David spoke of her, his wife of 8 years, with chilling detachment. "She's become deadweight," one message read. "Useful for the image, but I need someone who actually understands where the economy is going." Deadweight. The word burned into her mind. For years, she had hosted dinners, welcomed investors into their home, and sacrificed her career so David could build Harrison Technologies without distraction. She had believed his words when he told her they were a team. Yet here, in his private exchanges, she was reduced to a prop, an outdated accessory to be discarded once she had served her purpose. It wasn't the affair alone that shook her, it was the precision of the deception. David had planned his exit, aligning it with the company's IPO, waiting for the moment his wealth and power reached their peak before discarding her. While she was playing the devoted partner, he was strategizing a future that had no place for her. That evening, they went to dinner at Topping Rose House, their go-to restaurant in East Hampton. It had always been a place of comfort, with its refined dining room and understated elegance. But for Celeste, the meal was a test. She watched him across the table as he answered a call, his face shifting instantly into a mask of concern. He whispered into the phone about revenue forecasts and anxious investors, his tone carrying the weight of urgent business. Celeste, holding her wine glass steady, knew the truth. He wasn't speaking with a CFO in Seattle. He was lying with a fluency that came from practice, covering his tracks while spinning a false narrative for her benefit. Every word he spoke sounded hollow now, every gesture rehearsed. When he smiled at her, she studied the lines of his face and wondered how many times that same smile had been directed at Victoria. She thought of the baby. She thought of the word deadweight. She thought of the years she had given to build the life he was about to cast aside. By the time dessert arrived, Celeste no longer saw a husband across from her. She saw a man who had betrayed not just his vows, but the very foundation of their partnership. The life she thought was built on trust was in fact constructed on layers of deceit. She said little that night. She let him speak, let him weave his polished story of business stress and upcoming milestones. Outwardly, she remained composed. Inwardly, she was measuring every detail, every lie, storing it all away for the reckoning she knew would come. For the first time since the marriage began, Celeste no longer felt bound by love or loyalty. She had seen the truth in his own words, captured in glowing text messages that exposed both the affair and his contempt. Her world was no longer the same, and neither was her role within it. The discovery of David's affair had shattered Celeste's trust, but as she began quietly observing him with new eyes, she realized the betrayal ran much deeper than another woman. What she had uncovered in that marble bathroom was only the surface of a carefully constructed plan designed to erase her from David's future entirely. In the weeks that followed, she began using their shared Tribeca workspace while David traveled for board meetings, that she now knew were excuses for rendezvous with Victoria. Celeste's mind returned to the legal training she had once set aside. Methodically, she began reviewing files David had carelessly left accessible on shared drives and hard copies stored in locked drawers she knew how to open. At first, she looked for confirmation of the affair, receipts, hotel charges, anything concrete. What she found instead stopped her cold. Several financial documents revealed the existence of offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands and Singapore. Large sums had been moved discreetly from Harrison Technologies into these private holdings. The dates matched periods when David had claimed the company was under intense cash pressure. He wasn't just hiding money from investors, he was insulating himself from her. The puzzle sharpened further when she uncovered email exchanges between David and his attorneys. They weren't about the company's IPO or its intellectual property strategy, as she expected. Instead, the subject lines referenced prenuptial agreements. Her heart sank as she read threads discussing modifications to their prenup. Modifications she had never signed or even been told existed. The correspondence painted a picture of lawyers preparing to challenge the validity of the original contract on grounds that Celeste had failed to fulfill her supportive role as a spouse. Every line she read stung. For 8 years, she had done precisely what David asked: hosting dinners, smoothing over egos, traveling to events that boosted his image. Yet here, in legal language crafted behind her back, he was preparing to argue that she had failed him. The goal was clear: strip her of claims to marital property, position her as an obstacle, and leave her with almost nothing while he stepped into a future built with Victoria. It was not just about infidelity anymore. This was systemic betrayal. David had been laying the groundwork for years, constructing financial and legal maneuvers to cut her out of their empire entirely. His emails revealed timelines, even projections of how the IPO would multiply his fortune once public shares hit the market. The moment that windfall arrived, he would file for divorce, armed with hidden accounts, rewritten contracts, and a legal team prepared to portray Celeste as irrelevant. The shock gave way to clarity. She wasn't merely a wife wronged by an affair. She was the target of a calculated strategy that threatened to erase nearly a decade of sacrifice. Every gala she attended, every investor dinner she hosted, every moment she spent elevating his reputation, all of it had been quietly devalued by the very man who had once told her she was his partner. Celeste sat in the quiet of their penthouse late one evening, documents spread before her, the city lights flickering against the glass walls. She thought about confronting him, demanding an explanation, but the evidence left little room for denial. Confrontation would only accelerate his plans. She realized that if she lashed out too soon, she would lose the only advantage she had, his belief that she remained unaware. So, she made a decision that would define everything that came after. She would not confront David. She would not demand confessions or apologies. Instead, she would wait. She would study his every move, document every deception, and prepare for the precise moment to act. Strategic patience would become her greatest weapon. In that decision, Celeste transformed. No longer the wife clinging to the illusion of a perfect marriage, she became something sharper, more deliberate. The betrayal had expanded beyond the realm of love and fidelity into law, finance, and legacy. And in those arenas, Celeste realized she could fight, not as a scorned spouse, but as a strategist with the training, intelligence, and resolve to dismantle everything David thought he had secured. Celeste's decision to stay quiet marked the beginning of a new role for her, not as a passive wife, but as a silent investigator. She knew David's arrogance would keep him blind to the possibility that she was collecting evidence. That arrogance gave her time. Their shared Tribeca workspace became her command center. When David was away, she combed through files, transferring copies of contracts, bank records, and email chains onto encrypted drives she stored in secure places he would never think to look. Each document became a piece of a larger picture, one that revealed not just infidelity, but systemic corruption within Harrison Technologies. Celeste's legal training, dormant for years, came rushing back with clarity. She recognized that what she was finding went far beyond marital betrayal. There were traces of embezzlement, large transfers routed through shell corporations, with some funds directly tied to luxury apartments and gifts that David had provided Victoria. The affair, Celeste realized, had not just been emotional or physical. It had been financed by company money siphoned away from shareholders and employees. Faced with evidence that carried both personal and federal implications, Celeste reached out to people she trusted. Quietly, she contacted a few former classmates from Columbia Law, individuals who had pursued careers in corporate and securities law. Over discreet lunches and encrypted exchanges, she began asking hypothetical questions, probing the limits of whistleblower protections, discussing how offshore accounts could be traced, and what legal frameworks applied to intellectual property theft. She never revealed her full situation at first. Instead, she positioned her questions as academic curiosities. But the answers she received confirmed what she feared. David's actions were not only unethical but criminal. Her investigation deepened when she stumbled across internal communications about intellectual property. Buried among the folders of merger drafts and IPO preparations were contracts with smaller tech startups. On the surface, these looked like routine acquisition deals. But Celeste noticed troubling inconsistencies, mismatched dates, copied code segments, and non-disclosure agreements that appeared coerced. With further digging, she realized what David had done. Harrison Technologies had been systematically stealing ideas from smaller firms, filing patents ahead of them, and burying founders in litigation until they sold for fractions of their worth. For Celeste, the discovery was a turning point. The betrayal was no longer confined to her marriage or her future. It stretched across an entire industry, leaving a trail of crushed entrepreneurs who had been robbed of their life's work. She remembered conversations at investor dinners where David casually dismissed complaints from failed founders. Now she understood why he had been so dismissive. Their ruin had been his profit. The scope of his deception left her shaken but focused. Every new file she uncovered expanded the scale of his wrongdoing. Manipulated revenue reports to mislead potential investors, falsified compliance certifications, and IPO timelines deliberately adjusted to maximize his personal gain at the expense of transparency. What began as an affair had exposed a lattice of fraud reaching into nearly every corner of Harrison Technologies. Celeste's next challenge was protecting herself. She knew that once David realized she was aware of his activities, he would act swiftly to silence her, both personally and legally. That was why patience mattered. She couldn't rush to authorities without airtight proof, nor could she rely on emotion to dictate her actions. Every piece of documentation had to be precise, verifiable, and impossible for David's legal team to dismiss. Late nights in the penthouse, with only the city skyline as company, Celeste cataloged her findings. She labeled drives, stored duplicates in secure locations, and created meticulous logs. Each detail mattered: the dates of transfers, the email timestamps, the beneficiaries of every offshore account. She treated her task as though preparing for trial, because in many ways, she was. The personal hurt that had once threatened to overwhelm her was now redirected into methodical work. Celeste was not just seeking revenge. She was constructing the framework for justice. The man who had once underestimated her was about to discover that she was capable of far more than playing the polished role he had scripted. By the time she closed her laptop one particularly late evening, she understood the truth in full. David's crimes were bigger than their marriage, bigger than his affair, bigger even than the company he had built. What she held in her hands was evidence that could bring down a billionaire, disrupt an empire, and send shockwaves through an entire industry. Celeste had gathered months of evidence, enough to confirm that David Harrison's betrayal stretched far beyond infidelity. But knowledge alone wasn't power. If she wanted to protect herself and deliver justice, she would need to act in a way that left no room for David or his legal team to fight back. Quietly, she began her transformation from betrayed spouse into federal whistleblower. Her first step was reaching out to a trusted contact from Columbia Law who had built a career in the Department of Justice. Celeste didn't unload everything at once. Instead, she shared a fraction of the financial transfers she had documented, careful to prove credibility without overwhelming her contact. Within days, she was connected to prosecutors specializing in securities fraud. That connection shifted everything. Meetings followed in discreet locations: cafes far from Wall Street, law offices known for their silence, even anonymous conference rooms secured by federal investigators. Celeste carried her evidence in encrypted drives, neatly organized folders, and the now famous manila envelopes that had become her lifeline. Forensic accountants pored over the records, verifying each transfer, confirming the offshore accounts, and linking corporate funds to David's personal expenses. The deeper they dug, the stronger the case became. Celeste had exposed a company operating under false pretenses. Harrison Technologies wasn't just mismanaging money. It was manipulating revenue reports, falsifying patent ownership, and inflating its value ahead of an IPO that was expected to make Wall Street history. To prosecutors, the evidence wasn't just compelling, it was airtight. Still, Celeste understood that timing would be everything. If they moved too early, David might escape with a settlement, or worse, cover his tracks. If they waited too long, innocent investors and employees could lose everything. It was a delicate balance, and Celeste was at the center of it. She proposed a plan. They would wait until the peak of Harrison Technologies' IPO roadshow, the period when David and his executives courted major investors to drive up valuation. The spotlight would be on the company. David would be at his most confident, his guard at its lowest. By striking then, the impact would be catastrophic, not just personally, but publicly. Prosecutors agreed. The FBI was brought into the fold, launching a covert investigation parallel to Celeste's ongoing efforts. Agents mapped out raids on Harrison Technologies' offices in Manhattan and Palo Alto. They secured warrants for bank accounts, email servers, and cloud storage. The coordination was precise. Every move was designed to ensure that when David fell, he would fall completely. Celeste wasn't just a bystander. She worked closely with the team, providing context that no outsider could. She explained David's patterns, his travel schedules, his reliance on particular assistants, even the way he compartmentalized files between personal and company systems. Her insight gave the FBI an edge. They weren't just investigating a corporation. They were dismantling the habits of a man who believed he was untouchable. The plan grew more detailed with each passing week. Agents rehearsed raid logistics, prosecutors prepared indictments, and Celeste continued living her dual life, smiling at galas, playing the role of supportive wife, while secretly building the case that would end David's empire. One piece of the puzzle came from an unexpected source, Victoria Chun. The young venture capitalist, who was unknowingly carrying David's child, had accepted a luxury building in Soho as a business investment gifted to her through David. What she didn't realize was that the funds used to purchase it had been embezzled directly from Harrison Technologies. That transaction became a critical thread in the case, linking David's personal misconduct with corporate theft. The irony wasn't lost on Celeste. The woman who had been part of her private humiliation was now, unknowingly, providing prosecutors with one of their strongest tools. For Celeste, the months of waiting were agonizing but necessary. She kept her composure in public, suppressing the urge to confront David as he bragged about the upcoming IPO. She sat through dinners where he entertained investors, smiling on cue while knowing that federal agents were preparing to raid his world. Every time she glanced at him, she reminded herself, patience. Confrontation would have given him warning. Silence would deliver his downfall. The days leading up to the IPO roadshow felt like living on the edge of a knife. David was scheduled to present at Goldman Sachs, a pivotal moment that would either make or break the offering. Behind the scenes, the FBI finalized their plans. The raids would be simultaneous, striking both coasts, ensuring no evidence could be destroyed. The arrest would be public, humiliating, and irreversible. Celeste's role wasn't finished. She continued supplying last-minute details, passwords David reused, locations of safes in their properties, names of attorneys on retainer. Every detail mattered. She knew David's ego better than anyone, and she anticipated the excuses he would try to craft. Prosecutors prepared for all of them. On the night before the roadshow, Celeste stood in their penthouse overlooking Central Park. David was on the phone, boasting to an investor about the billions he expected to raise. She stepped into another room, pulled out her phone, and sent a single encrypted message to her contact at the Department of Justice. Tomorrow, he will be at Goldman Sachs at 9 a.m. He won't expect it. Her part was complete. What remained was execution. The morning that followed would shock Wall Street, ignite headlines across the country, and mark the downfall of a man who believed himself untouchable. And at the center of it all stood the woman he had dismissed as useful for image only. The wife who had quietly built the perfect case against him. The morning arrived with precision. At 6 o'clock sharp, convoys of black SUVs rolled up to Harrison Technologies' Manhattan headquarters. FBI agents in dark jackets moved swiftly through the glass doors, their entry timed with teams executing identical warrants at the company's Palo Alto campus. Employees, arriving early to prepare for what was supposed to be a historic IPO week, froze in shock as files were seized, servers disconnected, and executives quietly escorted from their offices. The company that had been touted as the future of American innovation was suddenly at a standstill. Across the country, David Harrison remained oblivious. At 9 o'clock, he strode into the Goldman Sachs headquarters in Lower Manhattan, dressed in a navy suit, exuding the charm that had made him a darling of both Silicon Valley and Wall Street. Dozens of investors gathered around as he prepared to present the final pitch for an IPO that was expected to value Harrison Technologies at nearly $2 billion. David was at the height of his confidence, unaware that his empire was crumbling in real time. As he launched into his polished presentation, a wave of movement swept through the back of the room. FBI agents entered, firm and direct, their presence silencing the air. David paused mid-sentence, trying to process what he was seeing. Before he could continue, two agents approached the podium. His investors watched in disbelief as the Billionaire'S CEO, who only moments earlier had been promising record profits, was read his rights and placed in handcuffs. Cameras stationed outside the building caught the entire scene, broadcasting it within minutes to financial news outlets across the world. The IPO was canceled on the spot. Word spread quickly through Wall Street, triggering panic among private investors who had already poured hundreds of millions into Harrison Technologies. By the end of the day, over $1 billion in projected investor value was erased. Traders who had once fought for allocations of Harrison shares were now scrambling to distance themselves from the scandal. The charges were announced within hours: securities fraud, embezzlement, and intellectual property theft. Prosecutors laid out the foundation of their case, much of it stemming from Celeste's meticulous evidence. David had siphoned over $50 million of company funds to support his personal lifestyle and his affair with Victoria Chun. He had acquired technologies from smaller startups by force, using Harrison Technologies' legal firepower to intimidate young founders and claim their patents as his own. And he had inflated company revenue ahead of the IPO, misleading both employees and investors. The press swarmed. Headlines blared across the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and CNBC. Tech titan arrested, IPO implodes, billionaire in handcuffs. The story dominated every financial feed. Reporters dissected the details with fervor, piecing together how one of the most celebrated tech moguls had built his empire on deception. But what shocked the public most wasn't just the fraud. It was the personal detail that emerged through prosecutors' evidence: David's relationship with Victoria Chun. Court filings revealed he had been funneling company money to support her venture capital firm and had purchased a multi-million-dollar Soho building in her name using embezzled funds. The building transaction was now a centerpiece of the government's case, connecting corporate theft directly to his personal misconduct. Victoria herself was thrust into the spotlight when prosecutors disclosed a string of private messages between her and David. One of them contained a pregnancy announcement, evidence that prosecutors used to establish his motive for financial crimes. The revelation shocked investors and the public alike. David had not only betrayed his wife, but had risked his company's future to prepare for a new life with another woman. At first, Victoria tried to keep a low profile, but her association with David was too deep to escape notice. Reporters camped outside her San Francisco office. Investors pulled funding from her firm. Her pregnancy, once something she had hoped would secure her future, became a liability in the court of public opinion. She denied any knowledge of David's embezzlement, but her reputation was already in tatters. For Celeste, watching the events unfold was surreal. From her penthouse window, she saw live coverage of David being escorted from Goldman Sachs, his face pale, his hands restrained. The man who once controlled boardrooms and charmed investors was now reduced to a symbol of greed and betrayal. She didn't smile, didn't celebrate. This wasn't about satisfaction. It was about justice finally being visible to the world. The collapse of Harrison Technologies was immediate. Employees who had spent years believing they were part of the next great American success story were left stunned. Venture capital firms pulled out overnight. The board of directors resigned en masse, leaving federal receivers to take control of the company. What had once been worth billions was now little more than a collection of seized assets and pending lawsuits. Financial analysts speculated on the ripple effects. Some predicted that the scandal would slow down IPOs across the tech sector, as investors demanded greater scrutiny of financial records. Others believed it would trigger a wave of regulatory reform. For startups once bullied by Harrison Technologies, the downfall was a form of vindication. Founders who had been forced to surrender patents suddenly saw hope that their innovations might be restored. Meanwhile, prosecutors tightened their case. The evidence Celeste had supplied, combined with forensic accounting and federal raids, created an overwhelming narrative of guilt. Every dollar misused, every stolen patent, every offshore transfer was logged, charted, and ready for court. David's defense attorneys scrambled to negotiate, but the strength of the case left them with little room to maneuver. For the world, the fall of David Harrison was headline news. For Celeste, it was the culmination of months of quiet preparation, patience, and courage. The woman he had dismissed as deadweight had become the architect of his downfall. not through confrontation, but through precision and strategy. As the cameras replayed the footage of David's arrest at Goldman Sachs, the question echoed across media outlets and living rooms alike. How could someone with so much power, so much wealth, and so much influence lose everything in a single morning? The answer lay not in his ambition but in his arrogance, his belief that he was untouchable. And Celeste had proved him wrong. As the scandal widened, prosecutors made it clear that Celeste Thompson's role was pivotal. From the earliest evidence she provided to the final encrypted files that tied David's personal expenses to company accounts, she had been essential in building a case strong enough to withstand any courtroom challenge. For that reason, she negotiated immunity agreements that would secure her future. Prosecutors formally recognized her as a cooperating witness, which shielded her from liability tied to David's corporate fraud. This meant that while his assets were frozen and his empire collapsed, Celeste's personal holdings, investments she had made independently before their marriage, and any property not purchased with stolen funds, were protected. Unlike so many spouses caught in the wreckage of financial scandals, she did not face bankruptcy or criminal exposure. Her immunity agreements also allowed her to claim certain legitimate marital assets. Though the government seized the Manhattan penthouse, the Hamptons estate, and the Palo Alto mansion, Celeste secured rights to trust accounts and pre-marriage investments that David's attorneys had tried to bury. This outcome was not accidental. Months earlier, she had quietly worked with federal lawyers to make sure her contributions and clean holdings were separated from his fraudulent empire. By the time David's arrest made headlines, her position was untouchable. But Celeste's story extended far beyond personal protection. One of the most remarkable aspects of the case was how her evidence restored justice to people who had been silenced for years. Among the files she delivered were documents proving that Harrison Technologies had stolen intellectual property from over a dozen startups. These were young companies run by ambitious founders who lacked the resources to fight a billionaire in court. David had weaponized his legal department to bully them into surrendering patents, claiming their innovations as his own. When prosecutors revealed this during court proceedings, those founders were invited to testify. Many of them described in detail how their work had been taken under the threat of financial ruin. Now, with Celeste's evidence backing them, they finally saw restitution. The court ordered that their patents be returned, and in some cases, compensation was granted for years of lost revenue. For these entrepreneurs, Celeste's decision to act meant not only justice, but the chance to rebuild their dreams. The financial toll on David was devastating. Federal marshals seized every property tied to fraudulent activity. The $50 million Fifth Avenue penthouse, once filled with priceless art and memories of charity galas, was emptied and sold at auction. The East Hampton oceanfront estate, where Celeste had first discovered the texts that exposed his affair, was listed and later purchased by a hedge fund manager. The Palo Alto mansion, once a symbol of Silicon Valley dominance, was confiscated as part of the restitution order. Even David's art collection, pieces from Chelsea galleries and Upper East Side auctions, was dismantled. Works that had been displayed as proof of wealth were boxed, cataloged, and sold to repay victims of his crimes. The proceeds from these sales, combined with liquidation of corporate holdings, were directed toward the $200 million restitution order handed down by the court. When sentencing day arrived at the federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan, the courtroom was packed. Reporters filled every seat, ready to document the conclusion of a scandal that had shaken both Wall Street and Silicon Valley. David entered in a dark suit, his once commanding presence diminished by months of confinement and public disgrace. He listened stone-faced as prosecutors recited the charges: securities fraud, embezzlement, and theft of intellectual property. Each count was tied to evidence Celeste had unearthed, leaving little for his attorneys to contest. The judge was unsparing, citing the scale of deception, the impact on investors, and the harm to innovation. He sentenced David Harrison to 15 years in federal prison. He was ordered to pay $200 million in restitution, an amount that ensured his once limitless fortune would never recover. The man who had lived in glass towers and oceanfront palaces now faced years behind bars, stripped of wealth, reputation, and power. Yet the most striking moment of the sentencing came from a witness David once believed would secure his future, Victoria Chun. To reduce her own exposure, Victoria testified against him. On the stand, she admitted that David had promised her stability and had spoken of leaving Celeste once the IPO was complete. But under questioning, she also revealed something far more damning. David had confessed privately that he planned to abandon her as well, even with her pregnancy. In his own words, she was a complication, just as he had once described Celeste as deadweight. That revelation shattered any remaining illusions about David's character. Both women had been betrayed, not only through infidelity, but through calculated disregard for their futures. For the court, it underscored the selfishness that defined his crimes. For Celeste, it confirmed what she already knew. David's ambition left no room for loyalty, not to his wife, not to his mistress, not even to his unborn child. As David was led away, reporters turned their attention to Celeste. Yet she avoided the spotlight, declining interviews and stepping quietly into a waiting car. Her work was done. Justice had been delivered, not only for herself but for the dozens of people harmed by David's greed. The collapse of Harrison Technologies became one of the most infamous corporate scandals of the decade. But buried beneath the headlines was the truth that without Celeste's courage, none of it would have come to light. She had risked her safety, her marriage, and her privacy to ensure accountability. The immunity deals had preserved her future, but the broader impact of her actions was what set her apart. For startup founders who regained their stolen ideas, for investors who saw at least partial restitution, and for prosecutors seeking to restore trust in financial markets, Celeste was more than a betrayed spouse. She was the reason justice had been possible. In the months following David Harrison's conviction, the headlines slowly shifted away from the downfall of a billionaire to the unexpected rise of a woman once dismissed as little more than a polished figure at charity galas. Celeste Thompson, the Columbia Law graduate who had stepped back from her career to play the part of a supportive wife, emerged as something else entirely, a justice advocate with a clear sense of purpose. Her transformation was not sudden but deliberate. Years of betrayal had left scars, but instead of retreating into silence, Celeste used her experience to confront the very systems that allowed men like David to thrive unchecked. She became a voice for those who lacked the resources, the influence, or the legal training to defend themselves. By doing so, she shifted the narrative of her life from one of victimhood to one of leadership. What distinguished Celeste was not simply her role in exposing fraud, but how she leveraged that moment into lasting change. Her testimony in Congress, delivered with calm conviction, helped lawmakers understand how intellectual property theft had become a silent epidemic in the tech industry. Startups with groundbreaking ideas were being swallowed by giants who weaponized legal teams to bury them in litigation. Celeste's evidence gave weight to these concerns, and her story humanized what was often dismissed as a business dispute. The ripple effects stretched from Wall Street to Silicon Valley. Investors who had once poured money into David's empire without asking hard questions began demanding greater transparency from the companies they backed. Venture capital firms, once dismissive of early-stage founders' concerns, instituted new protections to prevent exploitation. Even the Securities and Exchange Commission cited the Harrison case in proposing updated disclosure rules, ensuring that conflicts of interest and hidden liabilities could no longer be brushed aside. Perhaps the most significant shift came in the area closest to Celeste's heart: safeguarding innovation. With the settlement money she was legally entitled to retain, Celeste established a legal defense fund for entrepreneurs targeted by corporate bullying. What started as a modest initiative quickly gained traction. Within a year, her fund supported more than 20 small businesses in their legal battles, leveling the playing field against companies with endless resources. Founders who once would have been forced to sell their ideas under pressure now had the backing to stand firm. In several high-profile cases, her fund financed litigation that restored patents to their rightful owners, sending a clear message. No empire, no matter how wealthy or well-connected, was beyond accountability. The public response was immediate. Business journals covered not only the collapse of Harrison Technologies, but also the emergence of Celeste's foundation as a counterbalance to unchecked corporate power. University panels invited her to speak about ethical leadership. Nonprofits hailed her as a model for how personal betrayal could be transformed into social impact. What began as an intensely private struggle became a catalyst for systemic reform. Her efforts also reached government corridors. Regulators credited her with helping shape a new framework to protect startups from predatory practices. Provisions requiring transparency in acquisition negotiations, stricter oversight of corporate lobbying, and safeguards for minority-owned businesses were adopted after her testimony highlighted how the absence of such measures had allowed David's empire to grow unchecked. Through it all, Celeste maintained a remarkable sense of balance. She never indulged in public gloating over David's downfall. When asked about him in interviews, she rarely mentioned his name, preferring instead to focus on the lessons learned. Wealth without integrity, she told a panel at Columbia Law, is nothing more than an illusion. It collapses the moment it's tested. Those words resonated, becoming a touchstone for entrepreneurs and investors alike. For many, the case became a watershed moment in corporate accountability. It wasn't simply the fall of one powerful man. It was proof that even the largest structures could be challenged from within if someone was willing to take the risk. Celeste's courage demonstrated that strength wasn't always about building empires. Sometimes it was about dismantling them when they were built on deception. The contrast between her quiet determination and David's arrogance was impossible to ignore. While he adjusted to life in a federal prison, stripped of wealth and status, Celeste traveled across the country, meeting with entrepreneurs, policymakers, and students. Her presence alone carried weight, a reminder that power can shift, and that one person's resolve can protect many others from exploitation. In reflecting on her journey, Celeste often emphasized that the true victory was not financial security or public recognition, but the restoration of her own voice. For years, she had played the part of a supportive spouse, silencing her ambitions and ignoring her instincts. The betrayal she uncovered had been devastating, but it forced her to reclaim the parts of herself she had once set aside. Her story ended not with revenge, but with transformation. By exposing David's crimes, she had held him accountable. By creating safeguards for others, she ensured that her experience would leave a legacy. By speaking openly about integrity, she reminded the world that true power lies not in the accumulation of wealth, but in the courage to act when injustice is exposed. Today, Celeste Thompson is recognized not just as the woman who brought down a billionaire, but as someone who reshaped the conversation about ethics in business. Her journey from penthouse silence to courtroom witness, from betrayal to advocacy, continues to inspire. This story is a powerful reminder that justice is not only about punishment, but also about what comes afterward: the rebuilding, the protection of others, and the redefinition of strength. Celeste's greatest revenge was not David's imprisonment, but the creation of a world where people like him would find it far harder to thrive unchecked. Subscribe for more incredible stories, and let us know where you're watching from. Your support helps us uncover these powerful tales of justice and transformation.